after 3 days, 12 people, 7 men and 5 women, have been selected and sworn in to decide for the first time in American history whether a former president is guilty of a crime. An alternate has also been sworn in. 5 more are yet to be chosen, but Judge Merchan says he remains hopeful that opening statements can begin as soon as Monday. It is a major development in the hush money election interference trial. But it didn't come without some drama this morning, as 2 jurors already seated were abruptly dismissed. One was excused after questions were raised about the accuracy of some of the answers he had given the court. The other was dismissed after telling the judge she had concerns about her identity becoming public. The juror said that friends and family have already inquired about whether she's a juror. And given these outside influences, she was concerned about her ability to be fair and impartial. After excusing her, Judge Merchan instructed journalists in the room to stop reporting on prospective jurors' employers and asked them to use common sense when giving physical descriptions, all of which just goes to show one of the major challenges these jurors face in deciding the criminal fate of one of the most well-known and dangerous people in the country. As the New York Times puts it, quote, jurors are risking their safety and their privacy to sit in judgment of a former commander-in-chief who is now their fellow citizen, a heavy responsibility that could unnerve even the most seen-it-all of New Yorkers. And it comes, as the DA's office said this morning, that Trump has violated the judge's gag order an additional 7 times, including a post he made yesterday quoting Fox's Jesse Waters, falsely claiming that some of the prospective jurors are, quote, undercover liberal activists. Joining me now to discuss is Suzanne Craig, New York Times investigative reporter and MSNBC contributor. She was in that courtroom today. Katie Fang, trial attorney and host of The Katie Fang Show here on MSNBC, and Renato Mariotti, former federal prosecutor. Thank you all so much for joining me today. This is absolutely fantastic. I'm gonna start with this. Katie, this is just a general question that non-lawyers like me who lived through the OJ trial, it immediately occurs to me, given the concerns that we have about safety. Is there a possibility these jurors could be sequestered? Because it just seems to me that this question of keeping their identity safe and having the reporters not say, well, he had glasses and she was this color and that color and this hairstyle. It seems to me that sequestering the jury might be the safest thing. Is that a possibility in this case?
I don't think it's a possibility at this point. I mean, could Judge Merchan do it as some type of remedy because things get worse? Sure. But I think part of the complicating issue, Jason, is that when you're going through the jury selection process, when you do have the intentions of sequestering a jury, that is part of the analysis in the prospective jurors' minds as to whether or not they can commit to sit in service on a jury like this trial. And so part of what's going to be a problem is, can you really go back to square one? Can you really scratch everything? If you try to sequester this jury and then you get people that say, look, I cannot, for whatever reasons, maybe they have to care for somebody in the evenings when the court recesses. They're otherwise okay during the day, but they cannot make that commitment to be out of pocket literally for weeks. And so I think that's the biggest complicating factor that you have here. All of that being said, it doesn't mean that Judge Wagner Merchan is without some type of recourse if Donald Trump continues to violate gag orders and threatens the safety and the security of these jurors once we actually have our 12+6 alternates, right? And that includes everything up to confinement, incarceration, jail for Donald Trump. And I understand there's been arguments made that, oh, it's so logistically difficult because he has Secret Service, et cetera. But I've said this once before, and I'll say it again for you, Jason. There's really no other safe place than to be in a jail. You're in a cell, you've got walls, and you're not going anywhere. And so I feel like there are remedies available for the judge. Sequestering may not be one of the options at this point.
Suzanne, so you were in the courtroom today, and I want to ask about this because, you know, there's always been comments that Trump fell asleep and that Trump was having trouble paying attention, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you've been in courtrooms before. They're difficult.
Right.
They're not always fun. They're not always interesting. Just based on what we know about Donald Trump and what we've seen so far, what do you think his capacity is to hold himself to any sort of reasonable or responsible behavior through an 8-week trial? Look, I mean, he's a fidgety old man, and I don't know that he's going to be able to do this. What do you think is the likelihood of that, and how might his lawyers be anticipating the fact that he's hard to control?
Well, I think there's two things there, and I think one thing we noticed today is he was very alert and he was paying attention to the jury, but I think the variable in his alertness was that the courtroom was extremely cold today. And the other days it's been hot, and they have two speeds going on downtown in those courtrooms. It's pretty cold and it's really hot. So I think that really actually made a difference. So I think on the alertness level, he'll be awake if it's that cold. We all were. It was freezing, and it was freezing outside. I think on the other question, I think it's going to be hard for him to control himself. On Monday, we saw he was admonished by the judge for, I wouldn't say jury tampering, but he was kind of menacing with a juror. A juror was called in and asked some questions, and he was, doing his hand gestures and sighing. It was audible, and the judge said, enough. And if he continues to act up, there's no fine at the end of that. The judge can actually put him in jail.
Renato, speaking of the jurors have to give up a lot of their life. They have to put themselves in danger. There's a lot of risk. And then they have to deal with bad faith and dangerous members of the press. I want to play some sound from Jesse Waters at that other network and some of his comments about one of the jurors. Get your thoughts on the other side.
She said two things that really stuck out. One, quote, I don't really have an opinion of Trump. And, quote, no one is above the law. I'm not so sure about juror number two.
Now, look, this juror has now been excused. She's not going to be involved in the trial anymore. And I've said, like any sort of common sense person, it's very difficult to find anyone who doesn't have an opinion of Donald Trump. But I think what's important about what we just saw there is not just an absolutely terrible person masquerading as a journalist, threatening the life of somebody who's trying to do their civic duty, but we also saw what the overall concerns are that people have that, look, I'm just answering the letter that I got in the mail to do jury duty, and my whole life is being put up like a LinkedIn chat. Mario, what do you think can be done other than just asking journalists to be more responsible? What can be done to keep these people safe? Because I'll be honest with you, if we've already had two people drop out, I can't imagine that we're not going to have maybe a week into this trial, someone else say, I just can't do this and leave. And that could throw the whole investigation, the whole trial into chaos.
I think we saw the first step towards that today. When the main attorney, the lead attorney for Donald Trump asked the prosecution which witnesses are going to be called the next day, the prosecution refused to reveal those witnesses because they were concerned about intimidation. And what did the judge do? He backed them up. He said, yes, I'm not going to require the prosecution to tell you which witnesses are going to be called. Why does that matter? Well, I will tell you, as someone who's tried dozens and dozens of cases, that's a typical request, and it's a typical courtesy given so that this way the defense can prepare for those two or three witnesses and not have to be ready for all of the potential witnesses that could be called over a 6-week trial. What was the judge doing there? He's using his discretion and his control of the courtroom in ways that will penalize Trump more than $1,000, more than some inconsequential fine, but will actually hit him where it hurts in the trial where the judge has power. So I think Judge Merchan, both in instructing the press, as you mentioned earlier, and in controlling the courtroom, is starting to come with ways to put pressure on Trump and get him to behave.
Katie, one of the things that's been really interesting to me in this sort of jury selection is trying to find that sweet spot, right? There's absolutely nobody on this panel tonight who would ever get on a jury. They don't like lawyers. They don't like journalists. They don't like educators. These are people that most...
Oh, I don't know. Jason, first of all, I apologize for my dog, but there are lawyers that are on this jury. So lawyers do make it. You'd be surprised. But go ahead.
So that's the thing. That's what I wanted to ask about. Like, what's the mindset behind that? Because generally speaking, in my knowledge of trials, you're afraid of people like that. If I'm a lawyer, I'm thinking, oh, my goodness, if this lawyer is in agreement with my argument, then they're going to be sort of basically my paralegal in the jury room. But if they don't agree with me, this is somebody who is sophisticated enough to undermine my entire case. What's the mindset behind, the prosecution and the defense with something like having a lawyer on the jury or having an educator on the jury? What's the philosophy? What's the strategy?
Yeah. And again, I apologize. My dog is agreeing with you, Jason. So here's the thing. One of the wrinkles that happens is that because in New York, and it's unusual, because the foreperson is already determined by the very first juror who is sworn in and seated, who we already know is a gentleman. Like, because that happens, then it becomes a little bit okay to have lawyers. Why? Because normally when you actually have jurors go into a deliberation room or a jury room and they participate in the selection of the foreperson process, sometimes you're concerned if you're a lawyer and you're selecting jurors that those other jurors are going to militate towards saying, you know what, we want to make that lawyer our foreperson because they know the law. But considering the fact that some of the lawyers that have been kind of screened and filtered out through this jury selection process are corporate lawyers, they're not necessarily criminal lawyers, I think that kind of gives a little bit of ease to the people that are here. I put so much faith, Jason, in the ability for these Manhattan DA office prosecutors to make these decisions. They had limitless for-cause challenges. So if this juror could not be fair and impartial, they were gone straight out gate, right? But then they also had a certain number of peremptory strikes. And when the day proceeded and progressed today, the DA's office was left with 2 peremptory strikes when the defense had none left. And so it really is a little bit of a dance that you're doing in the art and the science of jury selection. But having lawyers necessarily on a jury is not a bad thing, especially when you have a case that involves documents. It's not particularly complex, though, but when you have to read a statute and you have to consider falsification of business records in the first degree because you're trying to cover up something else, sometimes lawyers are able to break down those statutes in a way that makes it better for them to serve on a jury like this.
Back with me are Suzanne Craig, Katie Fang, and Renato Mariotti. So I want to continue this sort of conversation we're having here about the jurors and what's to be expected of them. I'm amazed by this quote from a juror who was actually seated. One of the jurors who was seated at the very end, juror number 11, was asked earlier how she felt about Trump. She responded that she didn't have strong opinions, but added, "I don't like his persona, how he presents himself in public." She then said, "I don't like some of my coworkers, but I don't try and sabotage their work," she says, drawing an outburst of laughter from the jury box. Now, I'm amazed by that. I think that is amazing, but it sort of speaks to this idea that we're trying to find this safe space. Suzanne, you know, do you think that not only is that sort of a great quote, but do you think that's reflective of perhaps how a number of these jurors may feel, even if they weren't necessarily that eloquent? Because they can't say they don't know the guy, right? But they say that they can look at the situation fairly.
I think some of them, yes. I think we have some people, I'm sure, in there that don't like him, but can set aside those feelings and move forward. I sat through the Trump criminal trial, the Trump Organization criminal trial in late 2022. Donald Trump wasn't a defendant in that, so it was a little bit easier because they could say, you may hate the guy, but this is about his company. Can you set your feelings about him aside? But, you know, I do think that they're there, but I also think what we saw today, there's some that can be fair, and then we also saw some that got up and said that they could be fair, and then Donald Trump and his team, as well as the government, they have access to the names of these jurors, and they started scrubbing their social media profiles, and they found stuff that contradicted statements like, "I can be fair." You know, they had tweets that were pulled up that were disparaging about the former president, and those jurors were excused and were questioned about that. But we saw that today. So some of them maybe forgot that they'd done it. They didn't disclose it, whatever the case was. It's difficult to pick a jury. And you also are seeing coming into this, and it was jarring this morning. We had 7 jurors picked last night. We came in this morning, and one of them came in and had that change of heart. And part of it was, she was worried that her family knew that she was down there, even though she hadn't identified herself. And the other fellow there was excused. There were some questions about his integrity raised. We don't know if that's why he was excused, but in leaving, he also said he had questions about the identity. Right. So there's just a lot of issues, and it just goes to show how hard this is. And I wouldn't be surprised if we walked in tomorrow and maybe we lose 1 or 2 just based on what happened yesterday.
Renato, this is another part of this that I think is particularly interesting. The fear, right, the fear that everyone would have is that there's somebody who's just some diabolical genius, some Sherlock Holmes, right, who can beat a lie detector and manages to get themselves on the jury, and they have, an absolute love affair with Trump in their mind, or they absolutely hate the man. How likely is it? I mean, both of these sides are highly qualified lawyers, but how likely is it that you could have a mole? Heaven forbid, it's not like Jesse Waters is correct, but how likely is it that you could have someone who could get through this entire process, have scrubbed their social media, scrubbed their social media and made it absolutely incapable of knowing how they strongly feel purely for the purposes of, I guess, throwing the case for Trump or against Trump?
I think it's highly unlikely. It's much less likely than John Grisham or a movie director might have you believe. What's much more likely is that people may think that they can set aside their prejudices, but all people always have subconscious feelings. I think realistically, the biggest thing that Trump is looking for are not a hidden mole. They'd have trouble finding that person if that person existed. I really think his lawyers are looking for people who look at the obvious and see things that are not obvious. The people who think that maybe there is a flat earth, or maybe we're all part of a computer simulation. They're looking for people who are a little unusual and see the world differently. But I don't really think you have to be too worried about the diabolical, John Grisham-like scenario.
I mean, if you walk into the jury room wearing a MAGA hat saying birds aren't real and you're a Patriots fan, maybe they think that you're pro-Trump. Katie, I want to ask you this because, one of the other elements of this is, again, we talked about Trump's danger, some of the problems he presents, and he has already violated his gag order 7 different times. And this is a quote from the judge. I think this is really key. Defendant is directed to refrain from making or directing others to make public statements about any prospective juror or any juror in this criminal proceeding. This is the thing. And we've talked a little bit about this, but I want to know how far this goes, right? What is the scale of consequences for Donald Trump continuing to violate the gag order? Because it doesn't seem like anybody has it in them. He's been violating gag orders like crazy, right? He's a dog chasing cars. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he's just going to keep chasing the cars. So no one's throwing him in jail. People have penalized him. They've said it's bad. They give him a smack on the wrist, and he keeps going. What could actually happen here? What's the worst that could happen to him if he continues to violate the gag order? And heaven forbid, something dangerous ends up happening.
The short answer and the immediate answer to your question is he could go to jail. He could be incarcerated. That is allowed for under the New York laws and applicable procedures. It's a fine up to $1,000 each time, but it also can be a fine and jail, or a fine or jail. Putting it into context, Jason, the other times that he violated gag orders, for example, Justice Engoron's gag order where he got dinged $15,000 or whatever, that was in a civil fraud case. This is a criminal case. And that is why you see what Renata pointed out earlier in this hour, that the judge is not allowing the defense to get the names of these witnesses in advance because of a fear of what Donald Trump is going to do. I know a lot of people who are tuning in and watching right now are very impatient, and they don't understand why Judge Merchan hasn't done anything yet. But I want to reassure people that on Tuesday, there is a process and a procedure by which this contempt hearing has to be taking place. Under the rules and the law, you actually have to have an evidentiary hearing. It cannot just be the judge saying, I'm holding you in contempt of court, have a nice day. You have to afford Donald Trump, and I know it sounds unfair, but it's the way that due process is. You have to afford Donald Trump the opportunity at an evidentiary hearing to be able to show cause, meaning prove or show why he should not be held in contempt of court, because that is what the prosecution is seeking in this instance. And that is what is going to happen on Tuesday. And that is why Judge Merchan today took all of those violations of the gag order and said, I'm putting them all to be heard on Tuesday morning, and that's going to be done in the morning. I would also note, Jason, another kind of component that's happening here is, when our colleague Yasmin Vasugian interviewed one of those excused jurors, she said, and I know we all laugh about it, she said, he looked less orange in person. Now, I beg to differ. I don't know if he looks less orange, but the reality is she's seeing a man that is forced to have to sit in court, and you take away all of the bluster and you take away all of this idea in the public, in the media about what a big guy this guy is. And he's just this old dude sitting there looking orange and tired. And what it does, though, is I think it recalibrates everybody from the judge to the lawyers to the jurors to understand he's just a guy. He is not a deity. He is not a cult leader. He is just a man who has violated the laws. And just like all of us that violate a law, there's going to be consequences. So when he violates a gag order, the judge is going to say, you know what? You're not learning your lesson, and I can put you in jail. Or I can take you out of court. I can make you sit privately somewhere else where you cannot be in the courtroom. I won't let you have access to a phone. I mean, there's remedies there, Jason, and we're going to see exactly what happens when we have that hearing on Tuesday.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.